Blood-stained scrubs usually mean someone didn't make it through the night. Not that the night fought back. But in the frozen forests of Washington's Cascade Range, nothing at St. Eliza Field Hospital followed the rules. At 2:17 a.m., armed men cut the power, jammed the radios, and crossed the perimeter, expecting panic, screams, and easy control. What they didn't expect was a silent German shepherd who never lay down, and a night shift nurse who listened to the wind outside the way others listened to a heartbeat. Claire Monroe wasn't just the woman adjusting IV drips under flickering emergency lights. She was a name buried in classified files, a legend written off as dead, a ghost who had chosen bandages over bullets until the war found her again. Tonight, the hospital would stop being a place of healing. Tonight, and the leash would come off. And before dawn, only one of them would still be waiting in the snow. Before we begin, take a second to like and subscribe. And tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Snow fell quietly over the eastern slopes of the Cascade Range, the kind of snow that muted sound rather than announcing itself. In the distance, the small logging town of Ashford, Washington, slept under a pale wash of amber streetlights, unaware that the storm would last longer than forecast. At the edge of town, half hidden by pine trees and temporary flood barriers, St. Eliza Field Hospital glowed faintly against the dark, its modular walls humming, its generators breathing like tired lungs. It was 1:42 a.m. Inside, the night shift belonged to those who learned not to expect rest. Claire Monroe stood at the end of the main ward, her posture straight but unforced, hands folded loosely behind her back as she observed a heart monitor's steady rhythm. She was 41, though most people guessed older, not because of wrinkles, but because of stillness. Claire had the kind of presence that didn't seek attention and didn't surrender it either. She was tall, just over 5'9", slender without being fragile, her frame shaped less by fitness than by restraint. Her dark blonde hair was threaded heavily with gray and pulled into a severe, practical bun at the base of her skull. No loose strands, no softness. Her face was narrow, cheekbones sharp, mouth neutral by habit rather than mood. Her eyes were the thing people remembered. A pale gray blue, almost colorless under fluorescent light. Eyes that didn't flinch at blood, screams, or death, but also didn't linger on them. Claire Monroe spoke only when necessary, and when she did, her voice was calm, low, and precise, like someone used to giving instructions that mattered. She wore standard-issue Navy scrubs, clean but worn thin at the seams. On her chest badge, Monroe, C. RN, nothing else. At her feet sat Ranger, and he was a German shepherd, old enough that the silver around his muzzle had overtaken the black. His coat was thick, well-kept, though dulled slightly by age and winter air. His ears no longer stood fully upright, one tipped slightly at the edge, a scar hidden beneath the fur. Ranger was large, even for his breed, not bulky dense. He sat without shifting, amber eyes fixed toward the far end of the hospital, where reinforced plastic windows faced the forest. Ranger was officially listed as a PTSD therapy dog, brought in 6 months earlier to help veterans and first responders stabilize during recovery. He wore a simple harness, faded blue, with a patch stitched on crookedly, Therapy K9. But Ranger did not behave like a therapy dog. He did not wander. He did not seek comfort. And tonight, he refused to lie down. Claire noticed, but said nothing. Down the ward, Dr. Evan Brooks paced beside a supply cart, tapping a stylus against his tablet. Evan was 29, freshly assigned from Seattle, brilliant and visibly uncomfortable with quiet. He had a lean build, narrow shoulders, and perpetually tired eyes that hadn't yet learned how to hide fear behind professionalism. "Storm's supposed to break by morning," he said aloud, more to fill the silence than to inform. "Weather system's unstable. Dogs can sense that stuff, right?" He nodded toward Ranger. "Pressure changes," Evan continued. "My grandmother swore her lab could predict snow better than the news." Claire didn't look at him. Ranger's gaze never moved. Evan hesitated, then forced a light laugh. "Guess he's just on duty." Claire adjusted the IV flow with a small, exact turn of her wrist. "He doesn't like storms," she said. It wasn't a correction. It was a statement. At 2:06 a.m., the first call came in. A federal convoy, 3 vehicles, had been rerouted due to avalanche risk and hit black ice on Highway 706. Initial reports listed multiple injuries, 2 critical. Claire was already moving before the dispatcher finished. She checked power readings on the wall panel main line steady, backup generator armed. She glanced at the emergency exits clear. She passed the camera monitor mounted above the nurse's station, eyes flicking across feeds without slowing. Ranger rose the instant she did. Not a command, a habit. The convoy arrived 15 minutes later. The doors burst open with cold air and chaos. Paramedics shouted. Boots skidded on wet flooring. Blood streaked stretchers that hadn't seen combat wounds in years. Claire took point. She assessed, assigned, and redirected with surgical calm. Her hands moved quickly but never rushed. She spoke only in clipped phrases, each one exact. Bay 2, trauma protocol. Get him warmed, core temp first. Pressure, don't chase bleeding yet. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. So Ranger stayed close but unobtrusive, positioning himself instinctively near entrances, near Claire, near motion. A wounded man reached for him, fingers trembling. Ranger allowed a brief touch, then shifted his weight back toward the door. His ears twitched. The forest wind howled harder now, rattling the modular walls. While the staff worked, Claire slipped away. She moved down a side corridor rarely used after midnight, her footsteps nearly soundless against the linoleum. She checked the emergency stairwell, tested the lock, counted steps by reflex. She paused at the backup generator room, hand resting briefly on the steel door. Still humming. Still alive. At the camera hub, she scanned again. Tree line. Perimeter fence. Snowdrift patterns against the lights. Nothing moved. Too much nothing. Behind her, Ranger stood at full attention. Claire rested her hand briefly on his head, not a petting gesture, but grounding. Ranger leaned into it, just slightly. "You see it too," she murmured. Ranger exhaled through his nose. Back in the ward, Evan watched her return with narrowed eyes. "You ever think about sleeping?" he asked, trying to smile. Claire met his gaze for a fraction of a second. "No," she said. It wasn't defiance, it was memory. As the last patient was stabilized, the storm outside deepened. Snow fell harder now, thicker, swallowing sound. The town lights beyond the trees faded into a dull glow. Ranger paced once, then stopped, and stared directly into the forest. His hackles did not rise, his teeth did not bare, but every muscle in his body went rigid. Claire followed his gaze. She felt it then, not fear, recognition. Something old, distant, and unwelcome had found them. Claire straightened. Her hand drifted toward the radio at her hip. The night wasn't over, and Ranger, the dog who never slept, finally sat, not in rest, but in readiness. The storm intensified without warning. Snow thickened into heavy, wind-driven sheets that struck the outer walls of St. Eliza Field Hospital with a hollow, percussive sound, like knuckles against steel. The town of Ashford had all but vanished beyond the trees, swallowed by white and dark. Inside the hospital, the lights flickered once, steadied, then settled into a low, strained hum. The convoy arrived at 2:31 a.m. This time it wasn't confusion that entered the building first. It was urgency sharpened into something close to fear. 2 armored SUVs skidded into the emergency bay, engines left running. Federal agents jumped out before the doors fully opened, their movements abrupt, poorly concealed. They wore winter jackets over suits, pistols visible at their hips, eyes constantly scanning corners that didn't yet contain threats. Claire Monroe was already there when the rear door of the second vehicle opened. The man on the stretcher was unconscious, pale beneath harsh lights. He was in his late 50s, maybe early 60s, broad-shouldered even now, though the rise and fall of his chest was shallow and uneven. His hair was iron gray, cropped short in a way that suggested discipline rather than fashion. A dark stain spread beneath the blanket over his abdomen, slow but steady. This was not a traffic accident. Claire saw it immediately in the way the agents stood too close, and how one of them kept a gloved hand hovering inches from the patient's shoulder, as if guarding an object rather than a man. "Federal priority," one agent said, voice tight. He was tall, athletic, with the rigid posture of someone trained to project control. His name patch read Harris, though his eyes betrayed exhaustion. "We need a secure bay, now." Claire nodded once. No questions. Bay 1, trauma protocol. As they moved, Ranger growled, It was low and brief, more vibration than sound, but it cut through the noise sharply enough that everyone noticed. Ranger's head snapped toward the stretcher. His ears flattened, his body tensed. He stepped closer to Claire's leg, placing himself between her and the patient. The smell hit him first. Metallic, sharp, not blood alone, something else layered beneath it. Oil, propellant, residue that didn't belong on civilian clothing. Ranger's lips pulled back slightly, not in aggression, but warning. Claire felt it through the leashless space between them. She placed her hand on his collar, firm. "Easy," she said quietly. Ranger obeyed, but his eyes never left the man on the stretcher. The satellite phones went dead at 2:34 a.m. At first, no one noticed. Then one of the agents cursed under his breath. Another pulled out a device, tapped it twice, frowned. "No signal," he said. "That's not possible." Claire stood at the nurse's station, yet watching the monitors. She didn't turn around. "Weather interference," she offered calmly. The agent looked at her, searching for something. He didn't find it. In the trauma bay, Dr. Evan Brooks worked with shaking hands, cutting away fabric, calling out vitals. Blood pooled faster than expected. The injury was deep, precise, an explosive fragment, not an accident. "This isn't a crash wound," Evan muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Claire met his eyes for a fraction of a second. No, it wasn't. Down the hall, Sarah Whitlock froze in front of a computer terminal. Sarah was 34, compact and sharp-featured, with dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail that never stayed neat for long. She was competent, well-liked, and carried an edge of curiosity that sometimes drifted too close to trouble. Her hands paused over the keyboard as she stared at the screen. Claire Monroe's personnel file was open, or rather part of it was. Education, nursing degree verified, certifications, complete. Employment history, consistent, until it wasn't. There was a gap, 8 years, no explanation, no placeholder entries, just absence. Sarah frowned. "That's odd," she murmured. She wasn't suspicious by nature, but hospitals taught you to notice what didn't fit. She glanced down the hall. Claire stood near the trauma bay doors, posture unchanged, eyes distant. Ranger sat beside her, unmoving. Sarah closed the file. She told herself it was none of her business. In the supply wing, Ranger stopped short. Claire noticed instantly. They stood near the medical storage area, rows of shelves stacked with crates and sealed containers. Ranger's hackles rose now fully. His nose pressed close to a metal case pushed against the far wall, stenciled in faded red letters. "Defective X-ray components. Do not use," Ranger snarled, sharp and unmistakable. Claire's hand tightened into a fist. She recognized the smell now too, faint but present. Gun oil. Machined steel. Old and familiar. She knelt, resting her forehead briefly against Ranger's. "Quiet," she whispered. Not soothing, commanding. Her voice shifted just slightly, lower, harder. "Stand down." Ranger obeyed, muscles still coiled. Claire stood, straightened her scrubs, and stepped away from the crate. She did not open it. Not yet. The generators coughed at 2:51 a.m. Once. Twice. Then steadied. Around the hospital, people shifted uneasily. The storm pressed closer. Wind screamed through the trees outside, bending them until branches cracked under the weight of ice. Claire moved again, checking exits, counting doors, testing locks. She paused at the east wing window, watching snow swirl under the perimeter lights. The pattern was wrong. Too even. Too deliberate. Ranger paced behind her, nails clicking softly. He stopped when she stopped. Sat when she turned. "You remember this," she murmured, barely audible. Ranger's ears twitched. She leaned down, lips close to his ear, and whispered a phrase that hadn't passed her mouth in years. "Hold position." Ranger froze, every instinct snapping into place. The therapy dog vanished. Something older surfaced. Something trained. Back in the trauma bay, the federal patient stabilized for now. One agent stepped aside, speaking quietly into a radio that crackled uselessly. "We're blind," he said. "No SAT, no uplink. If this is interference..." Claire passed by, pushing a cart. "It isn't," she said softly. The agent turned. "What?" Claire met his gaze fully this time. Her eyes were unreadable. "Storms don't jam satellites," she said. "People do." The agent opened his mouth. Then the lights flickered again. Outside, somewhere beyond the trees, metal struck metal. Ranger's head snapped up. Claire straightened. The pattern was complete. This wasn't coincidence. It was preparation. And whatever was coming had already chosen this place. The first breach happened at 2:17 a.m., not with an explosion, but with silence, an abrupt, unnatural absence of sound that rolled in from the forest like a held breath. The wind dropped, the generator steadied. Even the snow seemed to pause, suspended in the air beyond the perimeter lights. Then the east fence went dark. Inside St. Eliza Field Hospital, the change registered before the alarm did. Ranger's head snapped toward the east wing, ears forward, body low, his tail stilled, muscles tightening as if a switch had been thrown. Claire Monroe felt it in the back of her neck, the old pressure she hadn't named in years. She didn't wait for confirmation. She didn't look for permission. "Basement," she said, voice even. "Now." The alarm sounded half a second later. It wasn't the high, panicked shriek of a fire alert. It was a dull, clipped tone security protocol. Evan Brooks flinched as it began, hands hovering uselessly over the patient he'd been monitoring, his face drained of color. "What's happening?" he asked. Claire was already moving, ushering staff and patients away from the main ward. "Controlled evacuation," she said. "No running, follow the dog." Ranger surged forward without a leash, cutting through the corridor with purpose. He didn't hesitate at corners, didn't look back. His paws found the fastest line through narrow hallways and storage alcoves, his body angling instinctively to shield those behind him. A nurse stumbled. Ranger slowed just enough to allow her to catch her balance, then moved again. Evan stared. He didn't need a command. Claire didn't answer. Down the east wing, glass shattered. Not from impact, but from pressure windows flexing inward as something heavy brushed past them outside. The sound echoed like distant gunfire. The first shots came seconds later. They were precise. Suppressed, the kind of sound you felt more than heard. Claire reached the stairwell to the basement and planted herself at the door, ushering people through in groups. Her movements were calm, measured, but her eyes tracked everything. Angles, shadows, blind spots. She placed staff at specific positions without explanation, hands guiding shoulders, fingers tapping twice on arms to indicate when to move. Ranger stopped at the top of the stairs and sat, not because he was tired, because he was covering. A man in black tactical gear appeared at the far end of the hall, moving fast, weapon raised. He wasn't local. His equipment was too clean, his posture too disciplined. He swept the corridor with practiced efficiency, visor glowing faintly under the emergency lights. Ranger bared his teeth. Claire stepped into view, raising her hands just enough to be seen. "Medical facility?" she called out. "Unarmed civilians." The man hesitated, just a fraction. His radio crackled. A voice whispered, distorted but clear enough to carry intent. "Secondary objective confirmed. Female operative on site, alive if possible." Claire's jaw tightened, so it was true. She hadn't come here by accident. She stepped back, pulling the stairwell door closed with controlled force. The lock slid into place with a heavy metallic click. Below them, the basement was cold and dim, lit by battery-powered strips along the walls. Concrete pillars divided the space into rough quadrants, storage rooms lining the edges. It smelled of antiseptic and damp earth. Claire moved quickly, repositioning people. She placed Evan and two other doctors near the far wall, behind reinforced shelving. She directed Sarah Whitlock to assist an elderly patient whose oxygen levels were dropping, her tone firm but not unkind. Sarah's hands shook, but she nodded. She had always been steady in emergencies, too steady, now some said. Years earlier, she'd survived a mass casualty pileup on I-90, trapped in wreckage for hours before help arrived. Since then, she didn't freeze. She compartmentalized. Above them, boots thundered across the main floor. Ranger took position at the base of the stairs, body angled to block the descent. He didn't bark. He didn't move. Evan whispered, "He's guarding the choke point." Claire glanced at him. "Yes." "You trained him," Evan said, realization dawning. "No," Claire replied. "He trained with me." The stairwell door shuddered under impact, once, twice. The metal groaned but held. Claire moved along the basement perimeter, scanning, counting. She found the maintenance room and ordered two staff inside, barricading the door with a rolling cart. She pulled a fire extinguisher from its mount and placed it near the stairwell, less for fire, more for the metal cylinder's weight. She wasn't building a fortress. She was buying time. A voice echoed from above. He amplified through a handheld speaker. "Claire Monroe," it called. "We know you're in there. You don't have to make this harder." Claire closed her eyes briefly. Then she spoke, voice carrying up the stairwell. "This is a hospital." The response was a dry laugh. "Tonight, it's a target." Gunfire erupted above them, louder now, unsuppressed. The sound of furniture splintering and walls being punched through by rounds filtered down. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Ranger growled, low and continuous. The stairwell door buckled. Claire knelt beside Ranger, pressing her forehead briefly to his. She whispered too softly for anyone else to hear, words shaped by old muscle memory. "Hold. Release on my mark." Ranger's body coiled, every nerve alive. Another impact. The lock screamed and tore free. The door burst inward, slamming against the wall. Two men descended the stairs, weapons raised. They moved with lethal confidence, scanning, adjusting, communicating in clipped phrases. They didn't see Ranger until he moved. He launched upward, a blur of fur and force, slamming into the lead man's chest. The man went down hard, weapons skittering across the concrete. The second fired, shots going wide as Ranger twisted, jaws clamping down on his forearm with bone-crushing strength. Claire surged forward, grabbing the fallen weapon and kicking it away. "Down!" she shouted to the staff. The second man screamed as Ranger wrenched him sideways, dragging him into the wall. The first scrambled, reaching for a knife. Claire brought the fire extinguisher down in a single, brutal arc. The man collapsed. Silence fell, broken only by heavy breathing. Ranger released his grip and stepped back, blood staining his muzzle. He looked to Claire, waiting. She nodded once. Footsteps echoed above again. More of them. Claire turned to Evan. "You see now?" Evan swallowed. "You're not just a nurse." Claire didn't correct him. From the stairwell, a voice muttered into a radio, unaware it carried. "She's confirmed. Not a civilian. That dog's military. This was never random." Claire heard it all. She glanced around the basement, the terrified staff, the wounded patients, the narrow exits. This place had been chosen. The storm, the reroute, the convoy. She hadn't been hiding here. She'd been placed. And now, the hospital was a battlefield. Ranger moved back to her side, blood and snow melting into his fur, eyes bright and focused. Claire rested her hand on his neck. "Stay close," she said. He already was. The basement lights dimmed to a low red glow as the generators above strained again, the sound settling into a rough, uneven rhythm. Dust hung in the air, stirred by distant movement overhead. The hospital was quiet in the way battlefields often were just before something broke. Ranger stood at the base of the stairwell, body angled toward the dark opening. Blood seeped from a shallow gash along his left shoulder where a blade had grazed him during the scuffle. It wasn't life-threatening, but it bled freely, soaking the fur into a dark, sticky mat. He didn't whine. He didn't shift away. Claire Monroe noticed immediately. She moved to him and dropped to one knee, her movements precise, economical. In the red light, her face looked sharper. Older lines at the corners of her eyes carved by years of wind, sand, and sleepless nights rather than age alone. "Easy," she murmured, fingers probing gently through Ranger's fur. "You're fine, you hear me?" Ranger's ears flicked back once. He held her gaze. She guided him away from the stairwell toward the deeper part of the basement where concrete walls thickened and the sound of boots above dulled. Evan Brooks hovered nearby, pale and shaken, clutching a trauma kit he'd grabbed out of instinct rather than confidence. "I can help," he said, voice tight. "I've stitched dogs before. Farm injuries." Claire shook her head. "I've got it." It wasn't dismissal. It was certainty. She opened the kit, laying out gauze, disinfectant, suture thread. Her hands didn't tremble. They never did when it mattered. Ranger lay down at her silent gesture, muscles still tense but compliant. She pressed a wad of gauze to the wound, applying pressure until the bleeding slowed. He flinched once when the antiseptic touched skin, then stilled, jaw clenched, breath controlled. "Oh, good," Claire whispered. "Just like before." Evan blinked. "Before?" Claire didn't answer. She threaded the needle in the dim light without difficulty. Her hands moved with practiced ease, fingers remembering patterns older than her nursing career. As she stitched, her voice softened, not for Evan, not for the others huddled nearby, but for Ranger alone. "You remember the range in Nevada," she said quietly. heat shimmer so bad you couldn't see the targets unless you trusted your nose. Ranger's tail thumped once, slow and controlled. She tied off the final stitch and smoothed fur back into place. The wound was clean, functional. "You'll scar," she added faintly. "Again." Ranger lifted his head and licked her wrist, once. For a moment, the basement fell away. The memory came uninvited, sharp as shrapnel. A younger Ranger, lean and fast, racing across open ground while tracer fire cut the night. Claire prone behind a rock outcrop, breathing shallow, finger steady on the trigger. And the command had come down broken and late, extraction compromised, everything burning. Then the blast. The ground had lifted her like a toy and thrown her hard. Her vision went white, ears ringing, lungs empty. When she came back, it was Ranger dragging her by the webbing of her vest, teeth locked, legs churning through smoke and debris. She had tried to stand. Failed. "Go," she'd told him, voice slurred. "Leave me." He hadn't. He never did. A distant explosion snapped Claire back into the present. Concrete dust drifted from the ceiling. Somewhere above, men shouted orders tight, controlled voices, professional. Claire finished cleaning her hands and stood, rolling her shoulders once. She crossed to the crate she'd opened earlier, the one marked defective X-ray components, do not use. The lid was half closed now, gear still arranged inside like a memory laid bare. Sarah Whitlock stood nearby, arms wrapped around herself for warmth. Her face was drawn, but her eyes were clear. She'd always been that way, quietly observant, shaped by the wreck years ago that had trapped her between twisted metal and fire long enough to learn what panic did to people. "That's not hospital equipment," Sarah said softly. "No," Claire replied. She opened the crate fully again, letting the red light wash over matte black metal and folded maps. "It's what comes after." Evan stepped closer despite himself. "You kept this here? All this time?" "I was told to," Claire said. "Told by who?" She paused. "Someone who wanted me alive. Or useful. Same difference." She lifted one of the laminated maps, spreading it across a crate top. Lines and symbols traced the surrounding forest. Access roads, drainage channels, not recent, but accurate enough to matter. "This unit," she continued, "was erased after a mission went wrong. Officially, we died. Unofficially, they buried the files and scattered the survivors," Evan swallowed. "And you became a nurse?" "Yes." "And Ranger?" Claire looked down at him. "He was the last one they couldn't replace." Ranger rose and moved to her side, favoring the stitched shoulder slightly, but refusing to show weakness. Sarah exhaled slowly. "They're here for you." "For confirmation," Claire corrected. "Proof that ghosts stay dead." The radio on the crate crackled suddenly, static resolving into a low, distorted voice. "Perimeter teams tighten the net. Subject is contained. K9 confirmed injured but active." Evan's face drained of color. "They know everything." "They know enough," Claire said. She adjusted the radio frequency with a careful twist, listening, learning cadence and spacing. Private contractors, not amateurs, men who worked for paychecks and deniability. She turned to Ranger and knelt again, meeting his eyes. "If this night ends," she whispered, voice barely audible. You have to live." Ranger stared back at her, unblinking. "That's an order," she added, softer now. His ears flicked back. He pressed his forehead briefly to hers. Sarah watched, throat tight. "You're talking like—" Claire stood before Sarah could finish. "I'm talking like someone who knows how this ends." A heavy thud shook the ceiling. The stairwell door groaned again under renewed assault. Claire closed the crate, not hiding it, simply sealing it for movement. She slung the radio strap over her shoulder and slid the folded map into her pocket. She didn't take the weapon yet. Not yet. She looked at Evan, then Sarah, then the others huddled in the shadows. "They'll breach again," she said calmly. "When they do, they'll expect panic." Her eyes hardened. "We won't give them that." Ranger moved back into position at her side, blood dried dark against his fur, posture alert despite the wound. Above them the storm howled, erasing tracks and swallowing sound. Inside the basement, the past had fully surfaced: training, loyalty, scars that never healed. Claire Monroe was no longer pretending. Ranger, the last K9 of a dead unit, stood ready. On paper, they had been dead for years. Tonight, they were very much alive. The first charge detonated somewhere above the basement ceiling, not close enough to break through, but close enough to make the concrete groan like a living thing. Dust poured down in thick sheets, stinging eyes, coating tongues with grit. The emergency lights flickered, steadied, then dimmed again. In the red half-light, faces tightened into the same expression, fear sharpened by understanding. They weren't testing anymore. They were committing. Claire Monroe felt it settle into her bones with a clarity that surprised her by its calm. She counted the seconds between impacts, mapped the rhythm, listened to the sound of men moving with purpose rather than haste. These weren't criminals improvising. This was a team that knew exactly how long reinforced concrete would hold once the charges were set correctly. Ranger paced once, and then stopped at her side. His stitched shoulder had stiffened, the wound pulling tight beneath dried blood. He ignored it. His eyes tracked the ceiling, ears flicking with each vibration. "They're going to breach from below," Evan Brooks said hoarsely. His voice cracked despite his effort to keep it steady. He had his hands braced on a shelving unit, knuckles white. "They'll collapse the stairwell. We'll be buried." Claire nodded. "Yes." Sarah Whitlock swallowed. She stood near the maintenance door, one hand resting on the oxygen tank she'd dragged there earlier, the other clenched into a fist. She looked smaller in the red light, shoulders drawn in, but her gaze didn't waver. "Then what do we do?" Claire didn't answer immediately. She moved to the wall map she'd pinned earlier with a strip of medical tape. Her finger traced a line along the far edge of the basement, toward the service tunnel that led to the old fuel intake unused, half forgotten. They're marked unsafe in building plans decades old. She stopped tracing. Her jaw tightened. "There's one way," she said. Evan followed her gaze. "That tunnel's unstable." "Yes. You can't." "I can," Claire said quietly. "And they'll follow." The room went still. Sarah's voice came out thin. "Follow you?" Claire turned to face them. In the red light, her expression was unreadable, but there was something final in her posture, like someone stepping onto ground they had already chosen. "They're here for me," she said. "They won't stop until they're sure." Evan shook his head. "You don't know that." "I do." Another explosion rocked the ceiling, closer this time. The maintenance door bowed inward, hinges screaming. Somewhere above, men shouted commands, sharp and efficient. Claire knelt in front of Ranger, bringing her face level with his. His breath fogged faintly in the cold air. He licked her chin once, anxious now, sensing the shift. "Listen to me," she said softly. "This is where you stay." Ranger's ears flattened. His body leaned forward, ready. "Ranger," her voice hardened just enough. "Stay." He whined a low, desperate sound and stepped closer, pressing into her knees. She reached up and rested her forehead against his, holding there for a heartbeat longer than she ever allowed herself. "You protect them," she whispered. "You don't follow me. That's the order." Ranger shook his head once, as if refusing. Claire stood abruptly, turning away before the hesitation could take root. She crossed to the steel security door that separated the shelter area from the service corridor. It was heavy, designed to hold back fire and flood alike. She braced her shoulder against it and hauled it closed. Ranger lunged. Evan shouted, "Wait!" Claire slammed the manual lock into place, muscles straining as the mechanism resisted. She forced it, teeth clenched, breath hissing through her nose. The lock caught with a brutal finality. The Ranger threw himself at the door, claws scraping metal, barking now sharp, furious, panicked. "I said stay!" Claire shouted back, her voice cracking for the first time that night. She didn't wait to hear the response. She turned and ran. The service tunnel was narrow and half-collapsed, concrete spalled away to reveal rebar like broken ribs. Water pooled ankle-deep, icy and black. Claire splashed through without slowing, following the route she'd memorized from the map. She could hear them now, boots pounding, orders barked, the clatter of equipment as they realized she was moving. "Contact! Subject moving south!" a voice shouted over an open channel. Good, Claire thought. Follow me. She emerged into the open loading bay as snow whipped sideways, the storm fully unleashed now. Floodlights snapped on one by one, harsh white cutting through the dark. Figures moved at the tree line, weapons raised, optics glowing faintly. Yet Claire raised her hands just enough to be seen, then dropped into a sprint toward the far end of the yard, drawing fire behind her. Rounds snapped past, chewing into concrete, spraying ice and stone. She ran hard, lungs burning, boots slipping on frozen ground. Behind her, The basement cameras caught it all in grainy black and white. Evan watched from the monitor, jaw clenched, heart hammering. He saw her silhouette cross the floodlit yard, small against the storm. He saw the men peel away from the building to pursue, like hounds loosed from a leash. Ranger howled. The sound tore through the shelter, raw and aching. He slammed his body against the steel door again and again until his shoulder bled anew. Sarah grabbed his harness, tears freezing on her lashes as she held him back. "She told you to stay," Sarah sobbed. "Please." Ranger's legs trembled beneath him, every instinct screaming to go, to chase, to guard. He pressed his head against the door and went still, listening. Outside, Claire reached the edge of the yard where the snow drifted deepest near the old fuel intake. She ducked behind a concrete barrier as another charge detonated, this one intentional, placed to collapse the tunnel behind her. Fire bloomed briefly, orange against white, then vanished into smoke and snow. The pursuing men slowed, spreading out, cautious now. Claire stood. She turned to face them. For a heartbeat, she thought of the basement, of the people huddled together, of a dog waiting on the other side of a door he couldn't open. She thought of a life she'd tried to build, quiet and anonymous, stitched together from second chances. Then the fire reached the fuel line. The explosion was not loud at first. It was a deep, concussive force that shoved the air out of the world, followed by a roar that swallowed everything. Snow vaporized into steam. The yard became a storm of flame and ice. On the camera, the image blew out to white. When it returned, there was nothing but smoke and drifting ash. No body, no movement, just the storm reclaiming the ground. In the shelter, the steel door shuddered once more, then went still. Ranger sank to the floor, chest heaving, eyes fixed on the seam where the light had been. The night pressed on, indifferent. And Claire Monroe did not come back. Morning arrived without ceremony. The storm loosened its grip sometime before dawn, wind falling away until the snow drifted straight down, quiet and indifferent. Pale light crept over the eastern ridge of the Cascades, staining the sky a bruised gray blue. Ashford reappeared piece by piece, rooftops, power lines, the narrow road buried under plowed snow. At the edge of town, St. Eliza Field Hospital stood scarred but upright, smoke curling lazily from blackened concrete where the blast had torn into the loading bay. Rescue vehicles arrived in staggered waves. National Guard trucks first, then fire crews, then a medical evacuation helicopter whose rotors flattened the snow around it into a wet, glistening ring. Men and women in winter gear moved with the clipped efficiency of people trained to step into chaos after it had already done its worst. Inside the basement shelter, people emerged slowly, faces hollowed by shock, hands trembling as adrenaline drained away. Evan Brooks leaned against a pillar and closed his eyes, the taste of dust still sharp on his tongue. Sarah Whitlock steadied an elderly patient, her posture straight, her voice calm in a way that surprised even her. She would think later about why she hadn't cried yet. The steel security door at the end of the shelter remained closed. Ranger sat in front of it. He had not moved since the explosion. The door was scorched, paint bubbled and flaked away to reveal raw metal beneath. A dark smear marked where heat had kissed it from the other side. Ranger's nose hovered inches from the seam, breath fogging softly. His fur was stiff with dried blood along the shoulder, the stitches holding but angry and red. He did not whine now, he did not bark. He waited. A guard sergeant approached cautiously, and he was a broad man in his 40s with a frostbitten scar cutting through one eyebrow, his movements careful, respectful. He knelt a few feet away. "Hey, buddy," he said gently. "We need to open that door." Ranger did not look at him. The sergeant glanced back at Evan. "Is he safe?" Evan nodded. "He won't bite. He stopped, unsure how to finish. He didn't have the words yet. When the door finally opened, it was with hydraulic assistance and a groan of metal. Cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of burned fuel and wet ash. The service corridor beyond was collapsed, choked with debris. The tunnel Claire had run through was gone, swallowed by concrete and ice. There was no sign of her. A recovery team searched the yard methodically, combing through snow and char, probing with poles, calling out names they did not expect an answer from. They found fragments of equipment, scorched earth, footprints that led nowhere. The blast had erased the rest. No body was recovered. By noon, a temporary command post was set up in the administrative wing. Statements were taken, times logged, a report drafted in careful language that smoothed the sharpest edges. Claire Monroe, RN, status deceased, cause presumed KIA during evacuation and rescue efforts. Evan signed with a hand that still shook. Ranger lay down only when exhaustion forced him to. He slept for minutes at a time, jerking awake at any sound, ears straining toward the door. When food was placed beside him, a bowl of warmed broth, then kibble softened with water, he turned his head away. Sarah tried to coax him, her voice low and kind. He did not respond. That night, after the hospital lights dimmed and the last helicopter lifted away, Ranger rose and walked the perimeter. He went to the edge of the yard where the snow was darkest, where the blast had bloomed into fire and vanished. He sat there, nose lifted, drawing in scents that were already fading. He stayed until cold crept into his bones and someone gently guided him back inside. He returned again the next night, and the next. On the third day, a man in a white coat approached him in the ward. Dr. Martin Hale was in his early 50s, compact and soft-spoken, with kind eyes that had seen too much loss to hurry through grief. He crouched and extended a hand, palm open. "You're a good boy," he said quietly. "We can take care of you." Ranger looked at him, just looked. Then he turned away and lay back down facing the door. Dr. Hale nodded once and stood. He did not try again. Days passed. The hospital reopened in limited capacity. Repairs began. Life, stubborn and relentless, pressed forward. The official story settled into place, repeated often enough to become solid. Ranger remained. When his wound threatened to reopen, Evan cleaned it and rebandaged it without fuss. When his ribs ached from the cold, Sarah brought blankets and sat with him until her shift ended. When the smell of food drifted through the hall, and he lifted his head, considered, and refused. On the 7th night, the snow returned lightly, soft as ash. Ranger slipped out through an open service door and climbed the low hill behind the hospital, the one that overlooked the yard and the tree line beyond. His joints protested with each step, age and injury speaking in dull pulses, but he did not stop. At the crest, he sat. The wind brushed his fur, carrying distant sounds engines on the highway, a train horn far away. Below him, the hospital lights glowed warm against the snow, a small island of yellow in the dark. Ranger lowered his head and nudged something hanging from his collar. A tag, old, oval, edges worn smooth. The lettering was faint beneath scratches and rust. K9. Ranger, no unit, no number, just a name that had survived erasure. He lifted his gaze and fixed it on the hospital, on the place where she had last been alive, where her scent still lingered faintly beneath antiseptic and smoke. He breathed in slowly, memorizing what remained. Somewhere in the building, a radio crackled and went silent. Ranger stayed. He would stay through the cold, through the repairs, through the quiet weeks when people stopped talking about the night because talking hurt too much. He would stay until the snow melted and returned again. He would wait, not because he expected her to come back, but because waiting was what he had been trained to do. Because guarding was what he was. As the sky lightened toward morning once more, Ranger straightened his posture and faced the horizon. The hospital stood behind him now, safe, whole enough. Ahead lay the forest, deep and silent, holding its secrets. When only the dog remained, the world did not end. It simply learned to be quieter. In the end, this story is not really about gunfire, explosions, or secret missions. It is about loyalty that does not ask for recognition. It is about sacrifice that happens quietly, without witnesses, without medals, without a name spoken aloud. In everyday life, we pass by people like Claire all the time. Nurses who stay late. Workers who carry burdens they never talk about. Men and women who choose to protect others even when no one is watching. And sometimes, like Ranger, we are asked to wait, to remain faithful, to keep going even after loss has taken everything familiar away. Not every act of courage looks dramatic. Some of the bravest moments happen in silence, in cold nights, in choices made when no one is there to applaud. This story reminds us that doing the right thing does not always bring rewards in this world, but it always leaves a mark. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone you care about. Leave a comment below and tell us what part stayed with you. And if you believe in honoring quiet heroes, please subscribe to the channel so more stories like this can be told. May God bless you, your family, and everyone watching right now. May He protect those who serve, heal those who carry hidden wounds, and comfort those who are waiting in silence. If you agree, type Amen in the comments.